Hey guys, welcome to my very first YouTube video. I have some ideas for this channel, but the main thing I want is to just kind of share like an unfiltered version of the process that you guys already see on Instagram or TikTok. So we're going to start with my most recent piece. All the materials are going to be linked in my bio, but these are my 3 most used tools. So I typically sketch out my ideas on Procreate before I start, but those ideas definitely evolved as the process went on. I've gotten a couple questions about how I make my base, so if you guys want a video on that, just let me know. But honestly, the base is never perfect, so the goal at this point is to like work around those imperfections. This whole area is smooth, but you can see right here, there are these little divots that I want to cover up. At this point, the planter has obviously been baked one time, and before I add any more clay, I like to map out the sections with pieces of paper, just so I can get an idea of where everything's going to go and the sizing. Then I take each piece of paper one by one and use that as a reference when I'm cutting out the clay. I could not wait to start in the fireplace, so I'm doing that first, and I usually like to cut it out a little bit larger just because you can always cut it down, but adding extra clay is just a pain in the butt. I'm using my own fireplace as reference for this one, so before I start cutting into it to open up that area for the firewood, I like to just sketch out the lines lightly and then cut into it because I'm indecisive and I need to see it before I do it. Then I added some shelving to the fireplace just so it didn't look so bare, but I don't add any like decor or anything else until it's been baked. Honestly, a large part of working on these pieces is knowing when to work with baked clay versus soft clay. For example, I'm working on the bookshelf now, so I'm using a piece that I've baked and I flip the planter over just so it's a little bit easier to attach. I like to use a combination of this Sculpting glue and clay to kind of sandwich in between and on top, making sure that I'm using a pretty thick layer on the bottom because you can't see it anyways. But then when it comes to the sides of the bookshelf, I'm using soft clay. Because the planter is not perfect in shape, there are little bumps and divots. I want to make sure that I'm able to like adjust the clay to fit against the planter, if that makes any sense. And obviously that's a little bit harder to do if the clay has already been baked. So you have to kind of pick and choose the best times to bake the clay or just leave it soft. Also, at this point, the piece has still only been baked one time because I'm still on that first layer of like building up the structures and the furniture, etc. So at this point, this is what the bookshelf is looking like. I wanted there to be like a little bench because I wanted to sculpt somebody that was laying down, just like surrounded by books. Next was adding the shelving, which took a little bit of trial and error just because I had to keep removing it, cutting it down to fit perfectly, and then putting it back. But once I was finished with that, I could definitely see the idea coming to life. There's just like a level of satisfaction that comes from your work finally starting to look good after being in that ugly phase that seems to last forever. So I added a cushion, and then I felt like that area behind was just a little bit too bare, so I added one more piece of shelving, and I feel like that really brought it all together. I've gotten a couple questions about how I attach things, so I wanted to give you guys kind of like a closer look. I kind of do like a sandwich method. I'll put clay and glue in between, attach that to the planter itself, and then I add an extra layer of clay on the bottom and on the top, ignore my cat, just to make sure that it's as sturdy as it can be and that there's clay from all angles keeping it attached. At this point, this is what the piece is looking like. It's almost ready for its second bake, but before doing that, I had to add the brick details to the fireplace. Now, I definitely thought that this part was going to be the easiest, but I just kept messing up the lines. Thankfully, I feel like clay is pretty forgiving, especially this clay, but this is just an example of how slow of a process it is, how many times I have to do things over and over again to get it right. I swear, if you look at my Instagram or TikTok, Twitter, whatever, you would think it's effortless because of the way that the videos are cut, but I promise you it's not. I promise I spend multiple times doing the same section over and over again until it's right. So if you're new to clay or new to creating in general, don't feel discouraged because I feel like all of that is just part of the process, or at least for me it is. And I've been doing this for like 2 or 3 years now. Once I was mostly content with the horizontal lines because they were never going to be perfect, I went in with the vertical lines to give it that brick look and just like really took my time making sure that I was mapping it out before putting in any like real indentations. Once the fireplace was done, I went on to the very last section before going to the second bake. Initially, I wanted it to be a cabinet that could like open and close, but that did not work. And I spent a long time trying to make it work. It did not. So ultimately, I decided to go with a little desk, like a writing area, because I feel like that kind of fit the library vibe. Again, you can see me adding glue and clay in between. I feel like just the combination of both of them makes it even more sturdy. I don't know if that's in my head, but that's what I feel. As soon as I finished the desk, I got super excited because that meant all of the structures, all the main furniture was done. It was time to start adding in those little details and just like fill in any of the space that was still open, mostly on the top section of the planter. One person I will always be indebted to is the person who told me to use alcohol to smooth down the clay. It's just so much easier than trying to sand it after the fact. So I usually just saturate a Q-tip and use that to rub down any of those rough areas before baking, just to kind of like smooth it out. So while the piece was baking, I decided to work on the little cushion for that nook area. First, I sectioned out the clay. I don't know why I did that because I ended up just smushing it all together anyways. And this was something that also took me a few attempts because at first it looked really weird. I made the cushions a little bit smaller, didn't like it, so I started over and I ended up just going with 5 larger cushions, and I feel like that looked a lot better. Next, I started filling in the bookshelf, and honestly, looking back, I kind of wish I had added a little bit more detail to the books themselves. At the time, it really just felt way too tedious, but looking back, I do kind of regret it, so I'm definitely going to try to make up for it when I'm painting in more of those details later. I should have counted how many books I was putting in there because it was a lot. It took a minute, but definitely worth it. I feel like it looks cute. Next, I wanted to fill in that upper shelf, so I added some books, some random decor. One thing about me, either it's going to be super intentional or it's going to be completely random. And in this instance, it's definitely just random. I also added a pillow and a little blanket because I really want the piece to feel like warm and cozy. Okay, so when it comes to sculpting people, this is something that I definitely put off because it stresses me out. Every single time it stresses me out. But what helps me is going section by section. So here I'm starting with the torso and I'm putting it on where I want her to lay just so I can see if the size is proportionate. It was too big, so I made it a little bit smaller. Still too big, so I cut it down one more time and got it to the right size. Once I was happy with it, I moved on to adding more of her features. The next thing I like to attach are the legs, but I like to use this bendy wire to do that. I feel like it just makes it a little bit more sturdy. This will also be linked in my bio, but basically I do it like, again, section by section so I don't get overwhelmed. I will do the thigh, and then I'll do the lower leg of the calf, and then I'll do the feet. Just so I'm not doing everything at once, I can actually see how it's gonna look, and I can make sure the sizing is proportionate to the rest of the body. Once everything is attached, I can just little by little start making adjustments to make sure that, again, the proportions are correct. And if sculpting people is not your strong suit, look at reference photos, or a lot of the times I'll even just take pictures of myself because then I can get the exact angle or pose that I'm looking for. Once the body was good, I moved on to the head, and I like to start with a little piece of foil wrapped in clay. First it was a little bit big, so I made it a teensy bit smaller and baked it before adding any of the facial features. When it comes to sculpting the face, I like to start with the brow bone before working my way down to the nose. And I'm, again, just working little by little, section by section. It's gonna look super rough at first, but just trust yourself. The next feature I would do is the mouth, and then I add on the cheekbones. Once that first layer is down, I'll just go back in and kind of refine the features and decide what else I want to add to the face. More layers, more cheekbones, but also making sure to look at the face from all angles because you don't want her to just have one good side. When it comes to the lips, I'll start with like that smile line. I don't really know what it's called, but I'll start with that line in the middle and then I'll start carving out the lips around that. And once I'm good with that, I'll do a little cupid's bow just to give it a little bit more definition. It was still looking a little bit flat to me, so I added some extra cheekbones just to make her pop, and then I felt like it was good. So the last thing I like to do is the eyes. Once her face was done, I moved on to finishing the rest of her body, so I started out with her arms before attaching her head and her neck to her body. Once that was done, I put her onto the planter and started to attach her feet. And like I mentioned before, I usually like to use that bendy wire, but when that's too large, I'll just use a bobby pin and use my wire cutters to cut that down just to kind of strengthen it. Obviously, her leg is like dangling out in the air, so I wanted to make sure there was something in there to stabilize her foot and her ankle to her leg, especially while it's baking, because sometimes things that are a little bit heavier will droop as they bake, and we don't want that. So before adding the clothing, I did bake her because it's way easier. I can honestly do a whole video on sculpting clothing, so if you guys want that, just let me know. But I ended up putting her in a loungewear set just to keep it comfy, and I was super excited to show you guys how I make her curls because I've gotten a lot of questions about how I do froze and curls. My favorite thing to sculpt. So I like to kind of like, as you can see, map out where the hair is going to be and make these like kind of lines back and forth just to see how the hair is going to fall and how to make it look as natural as possible. I also love to add just like a little bit of bangs or like a little bit of like overlap on the forehead. And once I have it mapped out, that's when I start doing this kind of zigzag motion back and forth to create tighter curls. So you can see me going around the whole entire thing in each of those lines, just going back and forth in a zigzag motion, and then it kind of like creates these little curls. And the tighter the zigzag, the more curly the curls are going to be. The last thing she needed was a book, so I made that for her to hold, which was pretty simple and straightforward. The one part of this that is intimidating is definitely the hands. I hate sculpting hands, I can't lie, but it does again help to go section by section. So I kind of start with like the palm and then work on the 5 fingers. This took so long that I ended up turning off my camera, so this seems like it went a lot quicker than it actually did. But when she was done, it was time to add in those little details, the final details that just kind of bring everything together. It's weird because in real life I'm a very simple person. I am not a maximalist, but when it comes to my planters, I cannot stand just open space. Like I feel like it just looks so boring. I don't know, I just love some art that's like extra and a little bit chaotic. By the way, if you see any little black hairs in this piece, no you didn't. So for this section I decided I wanted it to be like a little record player area with some vinyls. I added a plant to fill in more of that open space and then moved on to the record player, which was honestly so fun to make. 10 out of 10 would recommend. And then I obviously had to add a little speaker to go right next to it. I feel like it's just like so fun to make things I've never made before, so that's why I'm always trying different things with each planter because I get bored so easily. I just can't do the same thing over and over again. So at this point, I cannot lie, I'm pretty much just adding any random things that I can think of. No idea what a lot of them are going to end up being until I paint them, so we'll see. Stay tuned. This mini camera was pretty satisfying to make though. Next, I moved on to finishing the fireplace, and then I made like a little rack, like a fire rack. I don't know if that's what it's called, but the thing that goes inside the fireplace that holds the firewood. I tried to just add firewood, but it looked like it was missing something, and I feel like the rack kind of brought it together. I also decided to make like a little chair for the writing desk area, so this is a closer look at how I make the cushions. Initially, I was going to just like attach the legs, but they were not very sturdy, so I decided to drill holes and then stick them in to make them just a little bit stronger. So the very last step was to make the moving ladder for the library, and honestly this is what I was most excited for but also most nervous for, because although I knew I wanted to make it, I really did not sit and think about the logistics of how I was going to make that happen. So I spent a few days trying to figure it out. I'd obviously already made the bookshelf, so I kind of had to build it around what I already made. I also built the ladder, and then I used these eye hooks to not only hold the wire in place but to hold the ladder in place on the wire. Once I was happy with how it was looking, I decided to use my heat gun to set this just because I didn't want to worry about it drooping like I mentioned earlier in the oven. I wanted to have like a lot of control over it as it baked, but it will definitely still have to go in the oven. This is just for that one section. Once I finished, I looked at it and I felt like the only thing that was missing was just something in this section behind the woman that's reading. So initially I added these little lights and these books, just random decor, but the lights were kind of like bending into the wall and it was driving me crazy. So I took them off and I baked them before attaching them just so that they kind of kept their shape as opposed to like smushing into the wall. And once I finished that, the piece was officially finished. Now I still have to paint it. Still have no idea what colors I'm going to go for. Honestly, I haven't even thought about it, but I love this piece. I feel like it's super cute. Feel free to let me know what colors you guys want to see on this piece or even what you guys want to see from this channel moving forward. I'd love to know. This is the longest video I've ever posted, so if you made it to the end, thank you. And if you want to see how it looks painted, make sure you subscribe.